December 17, 1944. Near Bullingen, Belgium. The captured American supply truck sat abandoned on the frozen road, its canvas cover dusted with snow. Oberleutnant Werner Hartmann approached cautiously, his Kar 98 rifle ready despite the obvious signs of hasty evacuation. The Americans had fled hours earlier when German panzers broke through their positions, leaving behind equipment that standard Wehrmacht doctrine dictated should be destroyed or catalogued as spoils of war. But what Hartmann discovered when he climbed into that truck bed would challenge everything German propaganda had taught him about American industrial capacity. He pulled back the canvas. Inside were wooden crates stenciled with English text he could barely read in the dim winter light. His men gathered around as he pried open the first crate with his bayonet. The smell hit him first. Chocolate. Real chocolate, not the ersatz substitute German soldiers had been receiving for the past 2 years. Bars of it, wrapped in brown waxed paper, each one marked with a date stamp from just 3 weeks earlier. Manufactured in Pennsylvania. Shipped across the Atlantic. Delivered to the Belgian front. In less than a month. His hands trembled slightly as he held one of the chocolate bars. Not from cold, though the temperature hovered around -10 degrees Celsius. But from the creeping realization that this single bar represented something far more threatening than American tanks or artillery. It represented a supply chain his nation could never hope to match. An industrial capacity that could deliver luxuries to frontline soldiers while German troops scraped by on black bread and watery soup. The second crate contained cigarettes. American cigarettes, the kind German soldiers would trade a week's rations to obtain. Cartons of them, pristine in their packaging. Lucky Strike, Camel, Chesterfield. Brands that had become legendary among Wehrmacht troops who occasionally captured them. Each pack contained 20 cigarettes, not the meager 5-cigarette allotments German soldiers received when supplies were good. And there were hundreds of packs in this single crate, just one among dozens in this ordinary supply truck. But it was the third crate that truly unsettled him. Medical supplies. Sulfur drugs in quantities that would stock a German field hospital for weeks. Morphine syringes, sterile bandages, antiseptics, all manufactured with a precision and abundance that seemed obscene to men who routinely operated without anesthesia and reused bandages until they fell apart. Each item was individually wrapped, clearly labeled, designed for rapid distribution by medics who might have only basic training. The Americans had apparently designed their entire supply system expecting that ordinary soldiers would need to access these materials without specialized knowledge or equipment. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Hartmann had been fighting since 1939. He had served in Poland, France, and spent 2 brutal years on the Eastern Front before his transfer west. He had seen German logistics at their best and their worst. He understood supply chains, understood the mathematics of industrial war. And as he stood in that frozen Belgian morning, surrounded by more American supplies in a single truck than his company had seen in months, he understood something else. Germany had already lost this war. The only question was how long it would take for that reality to become undeniable to everyone. The morning's offensive had begun with such promise. Operation Rhine, Watch on the Rhine, Hitler's grand counteroffensive designed to split the Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. 3 German armies, nearly 250,000 men, supported by over 1,000 tanks and assault guns. The attack had achieved complete surprise against thinly defended American positions in the Ardennes forest. In the initial hours, German forces had broken through in multiple locations, capturing equipment, taking prisoners, and pushing westward with a momentum not seen since the glory days of 1940. But Hartmann had noticed something troubling even in those first successful hours. The American soldiers, many of them green replacements or exhausted veterans sent to this quiet sector for rest, had fought with a tenacity that contradicted every intelligence briefing about low American morale and poor combat effectiveness. More importantly, even as they retreated, American engineers had been systematically destroying or evacuating supply depots that German planners had counted on capturing intact. The entire German offensive strategy depended on captured American fuel. German planners had allocated only enough gasoline for the first 5 to 6 days of operations, calculating that advancing panzer divisions would seize American fuel dumps and supply depots to sustain their drive to Antwerp. This wasn't contingency planning. This was the foundation of the operational concept. Germany no longer possessed the fuel reserves to support a major offensive independently. They had to capture enemy supplies or the attack would grind to a halt regardless of tactical success. Hartmann's battalion commander had briefed them on this requirement with unusual candor. "We must reach and capture the American supply depots near Stavelot and Spa. Without their fuel, we will be stranded regardless of how many positions we take." The admission had shocked the assembled officers. German military doctrine had always emphasized self-sufficiency, the ability to sustain operations through superior organization and logistics. The acknowledgement that they now depended on capturing enemy supplies to continue fighting represented a fundamental shift in Germany's strategic situation. 2 years earlier, such an admission would have been unthinkable. Germany had been the master of mechanized warfare, the nation that invented blitzkrieg and perfected the operational art of deep penetration and encirclement. German tanks had raced across France in weeks, swept through the Soviet Union's western territories in months. German logistics had supported operations across multiple continents simultaneously. German industry had equipped the Wehrmacht with vehicles, weapons, and ammunition that made them the most formidable military force on earth. But that was 2 years ago. Now, in December of 1944, the situation had deteriorated beyond what most German soldiers understood. Allied strategic bombing had destroyed key production facilities. The loss of territories in the east had eliminated access to crucial raw materials. The Normandy invasion had cost Germany irreplaceable equipment and experienced personnel. Most critically, Germany's oil supply had collapsed to the point where fuel shortages affected every aspect of military operations. The statistics were stark and getting worse. Germany produced approximately 150,000 barrels of synthetic fuel per month by late 1944, a fraction of what the Wehrmacht required for sustained operations. American fuel production exceeded 5 million barrels per day. The disparity wasn't merely significant. It was civilization-destroying. No amount of tactical brilliance or soldier courage could overcome such fundamental material disadvantage. Hartmann pulled out a carton of cigarettes and distributed packs to his assembled squad. The men accepted them with expressions mixing delight and unease. They had learned not to ask too many questions about good fortune in wartime. But Hartmann could see the same realization dawning in their eyes that had struck him. These Americans they were fighting, these supposedly soft and undisciplined soldiers, had access to resources that made German supply chains look primitive by comparison. One of his sergeants, a veteran named Klaus Fischer who had been with him since France, examined the chocolate bar carefully. He read the English text slowly, his pre-war education including basic English that most Wehrmacht soldiers lacked. "Pennsylvania," he said. "Manufactured November 24th. That was 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks from factory in America to frontline in Belgium. How is such speed possible?" The question hung in the cold air. Hartmann had no good answer. German logistics moved by horse and wagon as much as by truck. The Wehrmacht had entered the war with over 500,000 horses and would employ nearly 3 million horses total during the conflict. By late 1944, approximately 80% of German divisions relied on horse-drawn transport for their supply lines. This wasn't a romantic connection to traditional cavalry. This was industrial failure, the inability to produce and maintain enough motor vehicles to mechanize the army fully. The Americans, by contrast, were completely motorized. Every American division relied on trucks, not horses, for logistics. This created operational advantages that Wehrmacht commanders could only envy. American supply columns could move hundreds of kilometers in a day. German supply columns, limited by the walking speed of horses, averaged perhaps 30 kilometers daily in good conditions. In winter, through destroyed infrastructure, under Allied air attack, German logistics often moved not at all. Hartmann ordered his men to load everything valuable from the truck onto their vehicles. The chocolate and cigarettes would boost morale, certainly. But the medical supplies might save lives. His company had been operating with critically insufficient medical stocks for weeks. The sulfur drugs alone represented more antibiotic capacity than his battalion had seen in months. If the Americans could abandon such resources in their retreat, what did that say about their total supply situation? The sound of diesel engines interrupted his thoughts. A column of Panther tanks rumbled past, their commanders visible in open hatches despite the cold. These were the spearheads, the armored fist of 6th SS Panzer Army driving westward toward the Meuse River and beyond to Antwerp. They looked formidable, their long 75mm guns and thick frontal armor making them arguably the best tanks in the war. But Hartmann knew what those impressive exteriors concealed. Transmissions that failed after 200 kilometers. Final drives that broke under sustained operation. Engines that required constant maintenance by highly trained mechanics. Every Panther in that column represented a gamble. Would it reach its objective before mechanical failure? Would replacement parts be available when components inevitably broke? Would there be fuel to continue operations even if the tanks remained operational? German armored commanders had learned to calculate mission feasibility not by enemy resistance but by expected mechanical attrition rates. 50% operational readiness was considered good by late 1944. Some Panther battalions reported periods when fewer than 1 in 5 tanks were actually capable of combat operations. The Americans had Sherman tanks. German tankers mocked them as Ronsons, cigarette lighters that burned easily when hit by German guns. The Sherman's 75mm gun couldn't penetrate a Panther's frontal armor at normal combat ranges. The Sherman's armor couldn't resist German tank guns or anti-tank weapons. In technical specifications, the Sherman appeared clearly inferior to German armor. But the Shermans kept running. Their transmissions didn't fail. Their engines didn't break. Their maintenance requirements could be handled by mechanics with basic training using standard tools. And most critically, there were thousands of them. The Americans could afford to lose Shermans and immediately replace them. German panzer divisions that lost tanks in combat or to mechanical failure often waited weeks or months for replacements that might never arrive. Hartmann watched the Panthers disappear westward and wondered how many would still be operational in 3 days. How many would reach the Meuse River before fuel ran out or mechanical failures immobilized them? How many would be abandoned by their crews when Allied fighter bombers appeared once the weather cleared? The answers to those questions would determine whether Operation Watery Rhine succeeded or failed. But standing beside that captured supply truck, examining American chocolate manufactured 3 weeks earlier, Hartmann suspected he already knew the outcome. His radio operator approached with news. Kampfgruppe Paper, the armored spearhead commanded by SS Obersturmbannführer Joachim Paper, had captured a fuel depot at Bullingen. Over 50,000 gallons of American gasoline, enough to sustain their advance temporarily. The news should have been encouraging. It confirmed that the operational plan could work, that captured American supplies could sustain German operations. But Hartmann found himself asking a different question. How many such depots did the Americans have? How much fuel could they afford to abandon during their retreats? The answer became clear over the following days as the German offensive developed. American forces were evacuating or destroying millions of gallons of fuel to prevent capture. They could afford to. Their supply lines stretched back across France to port facilities receiving continuous shipments from across the Atlantic. German supply lines stretched back to depots that were running dry, supplied by production facilities under constant air attack, dependent on transportation networks that barely functioned. The contrast crystallized into a single metric that Hartmann would later remember as the moment he truly understood Germany's situation. The Americans could afford to destroy their own supplies rather than allow them to be captured. Germany could not afford to adequately supply its own troops even when supply lines remained intact. That asymmetry wasn't just tactical. It was existential. It meant Germany was fighting a war it had already economically lost, regardless of how many tactical victories German soldiers might achieve. As December 17th wore into evening, Hartmann's unit pushed forward another 10 kilometers. They passed more abandoned American equipment. Trucks, some brand new, left behind during the retreat. Artillery pieces, complete with ammunition stocks. Supply dumps partially destroyed but containing usable materials. The sheer abundance was staggering. Hartmann had served in units that would have considered any of this equipment precious. The Americans treated it as disposable. They captured an American field kitchen that evening. Inside were stores of food that stunned the hungry German soldiers. Canned meats, preserved vegetables, coffee, real coffee, not the acorn substitute that German troops endured. Flour, sugar, salt, and spices in quantities that seemed ridiculous for a mobile field unit. The American cooks had apparently been preparing Christmas meals, with turkeys and hams that would have fed Hartmann's entire company. Fischer, the sergeant, stood in the middle of the captured kitchen and just laughed. It wasn't humor. It was the laughter of a man confronting absurdity too large to process normally. "Sir," he said, "we have been fighting on half rations for months. Our Christmas allocation is black bread and perhaps some horse meat if we're fortunate." These Americans were planning to serve their soldiers turkey and ham, while fighting a war, on a front line. The men fell on the food with desperate hunger that embarrassed Hartmann even as he participated. They had been professional soldiers, disciplined and organized. But months of inadequate rations had reduced them to something more basic. They ate until their stomachs hurt, gorging on meat and bread and real coffee with sugar. They filled their packs with canned goods, knowing that forward supplies might be scarce in the coming days. They divided the precious American cigarettes carefully, each man receiving a pack to save for truly desperate moments. As they ate, an older soldier named Hermann Baumann spoke what several were thinking. "I was captured by the Americans in Tunisia," he said. "Spent 6 months as a POW before I was repatriated in a prisoner exchange. The Americans fed us better than our own army feeds us now. Not luxury, but adequate. Regular meals, medical care when sick, mail from home that actually arrived." And this was in 1943, when they were still building their logistics. What must their supply situation be like now, 2 years later? The question lingered uncomfortably. Baumann had been among the 250,000 German and Italian soldiers captured when the Afrika Korps surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943. His experiences as an American prisoner had given him perspective that most Wehrmacht soldiers lacked. He had seen American industrial capacity firsthand, had witnessed the casual abundance with which American forces operated. His reports after repatriation had been dismissed as exaggerated or the result of propaganda exposure. But standing in this captured American field kitchen, surrounded by more food than they had seen in months, his observations seemed uncomfortably prescient. The German ration situation had become critical by late 1944. Official allocations provided barely adequate calories for soldiers not engaged in combat operations. Frontline troops were supposed to receive supplemental rations, but these often failed to arrive due to transportation breakdowns and supply shortages. Soldiers learned to supplement their rations through local procurement, which was military euphemism for taking food from occupied territories' civilian populations. This practice had obvious limits, especially in regions where civilians were themselves starving. American soldiers, by contrast, received rations that were the envy of every army in Europe. The standard American C ration provided 3,000 to 3,500 calories per day, with variety that included meat, vegetables, fruit, cigarettes, candy, and even toilet paper and matches. K rations designed for mobile operations still provided adequate nutrition and included comfort items like gum and coffee. D rations, emergency supplies, consisted of concentrated chocolate bars designed to sustain soldiers when nothing else was available. But beyond the official rations, American soldiers received comfort packages from home, recreational supplies through USO organizations, and access to post-exchange facilities that sold snacks, toiletries, and luxuries. The entire American supply system operated on the assumption that well-fed, well-supplied soldiers fought more effectively. This wasn't mere kindness. This was industrial capacity translated into operational advantage. Hartmann's radio crackled with updates from other units. The offensive was achieving remarkable initial success. Elements of 5th Panzer Army had broken through American lines and were pushing rapidly westward. 6th SS Panzer Army, despite stronger resistance than expected, was forcing American units back. 7th Army was securing the southern flank and taking thousands of American prisoners. The first day of Operation Watery had exceeded expectations in multiple sectors. Yet Hartmann couldn't shake his growing unease. Yes, they were advancing. Yes, they were capturing equipment and taking prisoners. But every captured American position revealed the same overwhelming material superiority. American soldiers wore winter gear that actually kept them warm. German soldiers wrapped themselves in whatever they could scavenge, often including captured Soviet coats or blankets. American wounded received morphine and proper medical care. German wounded often received nothing more than bandages and hope. American communications equipment worked reliably. German radios failed in the cold or lacked batteries. The material disparity extended to the smallest details. American soldiers carried waterproof matches. German soldiers learned to keep their matches dry using whatever improvisation they could manage. American soldiers had adequate socks and changed them regularly to prevent trench foot. German soldiers wore their socks until they literally rotted off their feet. American soldiers received regular mail from home, maintaining morale connections to their civilian lives. German soldiers might wait months between letters, if mail got through at all. None of this would matter if Germany could win quickly, Hartmann thought. A rapid breakthrough, the capture of Antwerp, the splitting of Allied armies, these might force a negotiated peace before American material superiority became decisive. This had been the logic behind every German offensive since 1943. Strike hard, achieve breakthrough, force the enemy to negotiate before superior resources could be fully mobilized. It had never worked. It wouldn't work now. But German strategic planning had no other options remaining. As darkness fell on December 17th, Hartmann's unit dug into defensive positions near the captured American depot. Tomorrow they would continue the advance. Tomorrow they would push farther westward, deeper into Belgium, closer to the objectives that German planners insisted were achievable. But tonight, as Hartmann ate real coffee with sugar and smoked an American cigarette, he allowed himself to acknowledge a truth he couldn't voice to his men. Germany had already lost this war. The evidence was everywhere, from the abundance of abandoned American supplies to the desperate nature of German operational planning. The chocolate bar in his pocket, manufactured in Pennsylvania 3 weeks earlier, represented more than a luxury item or morale boost. It represented an industrial economy that could deliver unnecessary comfort items to frontline soldiers across an ocean while simultaneously producing the weapons, vehicles, fuel, and ammunition needed to sustain multiple armies on multiple continents. Germany couldn't match that capacity. The disparity wasn't merely quantitative. It was qualitative, fundamental, civilization-changing. The German armed forces had approximately 7 million men under arms in December 1944. This represented total mobilization, the complete commitment of German manpower to the war effort. German industry operated around the clock producing weapons, ammunition, and equipment. German civilians endured severe rationing of food, fuel, and every other commodity. Germany had committed everything to the war, holding nothing back, sacrificing normal life completely to the demands of total war. And still it wasn't enough. The Americans, who hadn't mobilized completely, who maintained substantial civilian production throughout the war, who fed their soldiers turkey and chocolate while fighting, somehow outproduced Germany across every category. More tanks, more aircraft, more ships, more trucks, more guns, more ammunition, more everything, while simultaneously supplying the British, the Soviets, and numerous other allies through Lend-Lease programs that provided equipment worth tens of billions of dollars. The mathematics were impossible but undeniable. How did they do it? Fischer asked that evening, echoing Hartmann's thoughts. How do the Americans produce so much while seeming to sacrifice so little? Hartmann had studied economics before the war. He understood industrial production, understood the relationship between manufacturing capacity and resource availability. The answer was straightforward even if the implications were terrifying. The Americans had simply built a larger industrial base in peacetime, had developed mass production techniques more advanced than anything Europe had achieved, had access to vast natural resources, and had maintained their industrial infrastructure without damage from enemy action. Germany had excellent engineers, skilled workers, and sophisticated industrial knowledge. But Germany had never developed the kind of automotive industry that made America the world's leading producer of vehicles. Germany had never built the shipbuilding capacity that allowed America to launch Liberty ships faster than submarines could sink them. Germany had never created the steel production infrastructure that let American output exceed the combined production of Germany, Japan, and Italy together. These weren't failures of intelligence or effort. These were the results of decades of different economic development. America had been building mass production capacity since the late 1800s. Henry Ford's assembly line innovations had revolutionized manufacturing in the early 1900s. By the 1920s and 30s, America had perfected techniques of mass production that Europe barely understood. When war came, America simply applied these proven techniques to military production with devastating effectiveness. Fisher lit another American cigarette and stared at the distant glow of burning vehicles. Somewhere to the west, the battle continued. German panzers pushed forward into the winter darkness. American forces regrouped and reinforced their positions. Artillery exchanged fire. Soldiers died in frozen fields. The tactical war continued regardless of strategic realities. But tactical victories couldn't change industrial mathematics. Even if Operation Watery Rhine succeeded completely, even if German forces captured Antwerp and split the Allied armies, even if the Western Allies agreed to negotiate, Germany would still lose. Because the Soviet Union was still advancing from the east, and the Red Army had learned American production techniques. Because German oil supplies were exhausted and no tactical success could conjure petroleum from nothing. Because German industrial capacity was diminishing while American capacity continued expanding. Hartmann finished his coffee and crushed the paper cup, an American innovation that seemed almost decadent in its disposability. Tomorrow they would advance farther. Tomorrow they would continue fighting. Not because victory was possible, but because orders required it. Because military discipline demanded it. Because Germany had no path to peace except through battlefield success it could no longer achieve. He pulled out the chocolate bar again, this time examining it more carefully in the firelight. The wrapper showed a smiling cartoon character, some American marketing device. The production date and factory location were clearly printed. The expiration date extended 2 years into the future, suggesting preservation methods German food manufacturers hadn't mastered. Every detail of this simple candy bar demonstrated industrial sophistication Germany couldn't match. One chocolate bar shouldn't matter. It was trivial, insignificant, barely worth noticing in the context of history-shaping military operations. But Hartmann understood that sometimes the smallest details revealed the largest truths. This chocolate bar had traveled farther, faster, and more reliably than most German military supplies. It represented disposable surplus in an economy that could afford to manufacture and distribute luxuries while simultaneously producing unprecedented quantities of war materials. Germany couldn't compete with that. No amount of soldier courage, officer competence, or tactical brilliance could overcome such fundamental industrial disparity. The war would continue for months more. More soldiers would die. More cities would be destroyed. More suffering would be inflicted and endured. But the outcome was no longer in doubt, if it ever had been. Hartmann slept poorly that night, huddled in a commandeered American sleeping bag that was warmer than anything issued to German soldiers. He dreamed of supply chains and production lines, of chocolate factories in Pennsylvania and tank plants in Detroit, of shipyards launching vessels faster than submarines could sink them. He dreamed of a war that had been lost before the first shot was fired, lost in the factories and foundries and assembly lines that determined modern war's outcome more certainly than any battlefield. When he woke on December 18th to continue the offensive, he carried that chocolate bar in his pocket. He would keep it there through the remainder of the battle, through Germany's eventual defeat, through the occupation that followed. Years later, he would show it to his children and try to explain how a single piece of candy had taught him more about war's reality than years of combat experience. They wouldn't understand. How could they? It was just chocolate after all. But Hartmann would remember standing in that frozen Belgian morning, examining American supplies abandoned during retreat, and understanding with terrible clarity that Germany had already lost. The only questions remaining were how long the losing would take and how much suffering would be required before Germany accepted the inevitable. Those questions would be answered in blood and ruins across the coming months. But the fundamental truth had been revealed in a supply truck full of chocolate, cigarettes, and medical supplies. America's industrial might hadn't just won a battle. It had won a war. Everything that followed was merely the painful process of making that victory manifest to those still fighting. December 19th brought colder weather and clearer skies, both developments that favored the defenders. Hartmann's unit pushed westward another 15 kilometers, encountering stiffening American resistance. The initial shock of the German offensive had worn off. American commanders were rushing reinforcements to critical positions, evacuating or destroying supply depots that German forces hoped to capture, and establishing defensive lines that would bleed the German advance of momentum. Kampfgruppe paper, the armored spearhead that had achieved the deepest penetration, reached Stavelot but failed to capture the town before American engineers evacuated the massive fuel depot there. Thousands of gallons of gasoline that German operational plans had counted on capturing went up in flames, destroyed by retreating American forces who could afford the loss. Without that fuel, Pieper's advance slowed. His tanks consumed their remaining gasoline pushing toward La Gleize, where they would ultimately be surrounded and forced to abandon their vehicles. Hartmann learned of Pieper's fuel problems through intercepted radio traffic. The situation confirmed what he had begun to suspect examining captured American supplies. German operational planning had fundamentally misunderstood American logistics. The planners had assumed that American forces, accustomed to abundance, would lack the discipline to destroy their own supplies during retreat. This assumption had been disastrously wrong. American logistics emphasized mobility and resilience, which meant supplies could be moved or destroyed rapidly rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands. His unit captured another American position that afternoon, this one a casualty collection point where wounded Americans had been evacuated in haste. The medical supplies left behind staggered the German medic, Sanitator Wilhelm Koch, who had been operating with critically inadequate stocks for weeks. Blood plasma, morphine syringes, sulfur drugs, sterile surgical instruments, proper bandages and antiseptics, anesthetics for field surgery. Koch's hands actually shook as he inventoried the captured supplies. "This is more than our battalion has received in 6 months, he told Hartmann quietly. "In 6 months, sir. And these Americans abandoned it during a retreat. How much must they have in reserve if they can afford to leave this behind?" The question had no comfortable answer. German medical logistics had collapsed to the point where wounded soldiers often received nothing beyond first aid. Antibiotics were reserved for the most critical cases. Morphine was so scarce that amputations were sometimes performed with nothing more than alcohol or no anesthetic at all. Blood transfusions had become nearly impossible due to lack of plasma and refrigeration. German military hospitals were overwhelmed and undersupplied, forced to make impossible triage decisions daily. American military medicine, by contrast, operated with resources that seemed almost wasteful from the German perspective. Every American soldier carried a first aid kit with supplies that German soldiers would have considered luxuries. American medics were trained and equipped to provide advanced care in the field. American evacuation procedures ensured that wounded soldiers reached proper medical facilities within hours rather than days. American blood banks operated near the front lines, supplied through a nationwide donation system that kept plasma available for transfusions. The disparity in medical care translated directly to casualty statistics. American soldiers had substantially higher survival rates for comparable wounds than German soldiers. This wasn't because American doctors were better trained or more skilled. This was purely a function of resources. Adequate supplies, rapid evacuation, advanced treatment, all made possible by industrial capacity that could manufacture and deliver medical materials in unprecedented quantities. Koch carefully loaded every usable item from the American casualty station onto their vehicles. He treated each bottle of plasma and box of bandages like the precious resource it was, knowing that these captured supplies might be the difference between life and death for wounded German soldiers. As he worked, he asked Hartmann a question that had been troubling him since they began capturing American equipment. "Sir, if the Americans can supply their frontline soldiers with such abundance, what must their homeland be like? What kind of nation can fight a war across 2 oceans while maintaining such logistics?" Hartmann had been asking himself similar questions. The answer, based on everything he had observed, was profound and unsettling. America was a different kind of power than Germany had ever faced. Not just larger in territory or population, though both were true, but different in fundamental industrial capacity and organizational efficiency. America had built a continental economy with vast natural resources, advanced technology, and production systems that Europe couldn't match. The numbers told the story clearly for those willing to examine them. America produced approximately 50% of the world's manufactured goods in 1944. This single nation outproduced the entire British Empire, the Soviet Union, Germany, Japan, and Italy combined. American factories turned out military equipment at rates that seemed impossible. In 1944 alone, America manufactured nearly 100,000 aircraft, 40,000 tanks, and millions of small arms. These figures exceeded Germany's total production across the war's entire duration in some categories. But beyond raw production numbers, American logistics demonstrated sophistication that German planning had never achieved. The Liberty ship program exemplified this difference. American shipyards were producing cargo vessels faster than German submarines could sink them, using modular construction techniques and assembly line methods adapted from automotive manufacturing. At peak production, American yards launched a Liberty ship every 42 hours. The entire program produced over 2,700 vessels, creating cargo capacity that made transoceanic supply lines function reliably. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Germany had nothing comparable. German shipbuilding remained largely traditional, with each vessel constructed individually by skilled craftsmen using conventional methods. German yards produced excellent ships, but slowly and in insufficient numbers. The Kriegsmarine had never possessed enough vessels to sustain the far-flung campaigns Germany attempted. German logistics relied heavily on captured equipment and rail lines that were increasingly destroyed by Allied bombing. As December 19th wore into evening, Hartmann's unit encountered the first serious American counterattacks. Elements of the American 82nd Airborne Division were arriving from reserve positions, airlifted to the battlefield with remarkable speed. American logistics had transported thousands of paratroopers and their equipment hundreds of kilometers in less than 48 hours. German forces, advancing on roads clogged with traffic and suffering fuel shortages, could barely maintain forward momentum. The contrast in mobility advantages spoke volumes about underlying logistical capabilities. That night, Hartmann's unit camped in an abandoned Belgian village. American forces had evacuated the position cleanly, destroying anything they couldn't take with them. But even in destruction, the evidence of American abundance was obvious. Burnt-out supply dumps contained more equipment than German units saw in months. Destroyed vehicles were newer and better maintained than most Wehrmacht equipment. Even the garbage left behind revealed telling details about American logistics. Fisher found a discarded American field manual during their sweep of the village. The manual detailed procedures for maintaining Jeeps, the ubiquitous American utility vehicle. Fisher had seen these vehicles before, had driven captured Jeeps when German vehicles broke down. But reading the manual revealed design philosophy differences that explained much about American military effectiveness. The Jeep had been engineered for simplicity and reliability. Every component was designed to be maintained by soldiers with minimal training using basic tools. The manual included detailed illustrations and step-by-step instructions written at a basic reading level. Spare parts were standardized, meaning any Jeep component would fit any Jeep without custom fitting. The entire vehicle embodied principles of mass production and field maintenance that German military vehicles rarely achieved. German military vehicles, by comparison, often required specialized knowledge and tools for maintenance. Components varied between manufacturers, making spare parts logistics complicated. Vehicles were over-engineered for performance rather than simplified for reliability. The Kübelwagen, Germany's rough equivalent to the Jeep, was an excellent vehicle in many respects, but it lacked four-wheel drive and required more maintenance skill than most Wehrmacht mechanics possessed. More significantly, America produced over 640,000 Jeeps during the war. Germany manufactured approximately 50,000 Kübelwagens. The ratio was 13-1. Even if German vehicles were technically superior, which was debatable, they couldn't overcome such numerical disadvantage. American units that lost vehicles simply requested replacements that arrived within days. German units that lost vehicles often operated under-equipped for months. Fischer tossed the manual aside with disgust. They designed their entire military around ordinary soldiers being able to maintain equipment, he said. We design ours assuming we'll always have expert mechanics available. What happens when the mechanics are dead and we're left with farmers trying to fix broken Panthers? The question was rhetorical but pointed. Germany's military increasingly consisted of poorly trained replacements, old men, and boys conscripted as the manpower situation deteriorated. These soldiers lacked the technical education that earlier Wehrmacht troops had possessed. German equipment that required expert maintenance became progressively harder to keep operational as experienced personnel were killed and replacements proved inadequately trained. American equipment, designed assuming operators would have minimal training, functioned adequately regardless of personnel quality. As December 20th dawned, news reached Hartmann's unit about the defense of Bastogne. The American 101st Airborne Division had been rushed to the town, a critical road junction, and was establishing defensive positions despite being partially surrounded by German forces. 5th Panzer Army's advance had bypassed Bastogne rather than getting bogged down in street fighting, but the town's resistance created a problem. As long as Americans held Bastogne, German supply lines would be threatened and reinforcement would be difficult. German commanders demanded Bastogne's surrender. American General Anthony McAuliffe reportedly responded with a single word that would become legendary: nuts. The Americans would not surrender. They would hold despite being outnumbered and surrounded. And they could hold because American logistics made sustained defense possible even under siege conditions. Within days, American aircraft would begin dropping supplies to the surrounded garrison at Bastogne. Food, ammunition, medical supplies, all delivered by air despite German anti-aircraft fire and adverse weather. The resupply missions demonstrated American air superiority and logistical flexibility. German forces besieging Bastogne could barely sustain their own operations, much less prevent American resupply. The siege that was supposed to strangle the defenders instead revealed the limits of German offensive capability. Hartmann listened to reports about Bastogne and understood that the pattern was repeating everywhere along the front. Initial German success followed by stiffening resistance as American reinforcements arrived and German logistics failed. The offensive that was supposed to reach Antwerp in 7 to 10 days was already running behind schedule on day 5. Fuel shortages were affecting every German unit. Vehicle breakdowns were mounting. Supply lines were stretched thin and under constant American air attack whenever weather permitted flying. His unit captured a small American motor pool on December 20th, finding several jeeps and trucks in various states of maintenance. The American mechanics had fled, leaving behind tools and equipment that German mechanics eyed enviously. One vehicle had been completely disassembled for engine work, the components laid out systematically with careful labeling. Even in disassembly, the Jeep's simplicity was evident. A German mechanic examined the engine and shook his head in wonder. "I could teach a farmhand to rebuild this engine in a week," he said. "Maybe less. Everything is accessible, clearly marked, designed to come apart easily. Our vehicles require trained specialists and specialized equipment. The Americans designed theirs so anyone with basic knowledge could maintain them." This philosophy extended throughout American military equipment. Weapons were designed for simplicity and reliability rather than perfection. The M1 Garand rifle, standard issue for American infantry, was semi-automatic and reasonably reliable under field conditions. German soldiers often preferred captured Garands to their own weapons because the American rifles worked consistently and required less maintenance skill. The German Kar 98 bolt-action rifle was accurate and well-made, but it was also a weapon designed in the 1890s and barely modified since. American weapons reflected modern manufacturing methods and design thinking. Artillery told the same story. American artillery pieces like the 105mm howitzer were produced in enormous quantities using standardized designs and interchangeable parts. German artillery included numerous types and calibers, each requiring unique ammunition and spare parts. This variety complicated logistics and reduced overall effectiveness despite individual German guns often having superior technical specifications. The Americans had learned that adequate equipment delivered in overwhelming quantities outperformed superior equipment delivered in insufficient amounts. By December 21st, the German offensive's momentum had clearly stalled. Some units had penetrated 50 miles into American lines, creating the bulge that gave the battle its name. But German forces had failed to capture crucial objectives like Stavelot, St. Vith, and Bastogne. They had failed to seize the fuel depots needed to sustain operations. They had failed to reach the Meuse River, much less advanced to Antwerp. Most critically, the weather was clearing, which meant American air superiority would soon become a decisive factor. Hartmann's unit spent December 21st digging defensive positions rather than advancing. The orders were euphemistically termed consolidation, but everyone understood what they really meant. The offensive had stalled. German forces now faced the prospect of American counterattacks with their own supplies running critically low and reinforcement unlikely. The operation that was supposed to split Allied armies and force negotiations had instead created a vulnerable salient that American forces could isolate and destroy. That evening, German soldiers in Hartmann's unit shared a Christmas meal using captured American supplies. Turkey from an abandoned American field kitchen. Coffee with real sugar. Chocolate bars for dessert. They ate better than they had in months, thanks entirely to enemy logistics. The irony was bitter and impossible to ignore. German soldiers celebrating a German offensive using American food because German logistics couldn't adequately supply its own forces. Fischer raised a tin cup of American coffee in a mock toast. To the Americans, he said with dark humor, "May they continue providing us with supplies since our own quartermasters cannot." The men laughed, but the laughter was hollow. They understood what this dependence meant. They understood that armies who relied on capturing enemy supplies for survival were armies that had already strategically lost. Christmas approached with the offensive clearly failing. German forces held a large salient but controlled no critical objectives. American forces were counterattacking from multiple directions, supported by overwhelming air power now that weather had cleared. German casualties were mounting, with killed, wounded, and captured totaling tens of thousands. Vehicle losses were catastrophic, with mechanical failures and fuel shortages immobilizing armor that enemy action hadn't destroyed. The entire operation was collapsing not because American forces had outfought German troops, but because logistics had failed and American material superiority had proven decisive. Hartmann received orders to prepare for defensive operations on December 23rd. The offensive was effectively over, though no official announcement would be made. German forces would attempt to hold the ground they had gained, knowing this was impossible against American counterattacks. The operation had consumed Germany's last strategic reserves, destroyed irreplaceable equipment, and achieved nothing except demonstrating how thoroughly American industrial capacity had eclipsed German military capability. On Christmas Eve, Allied bombers struck German supply lines with devastating effectiveness. Clear weather had allowed American and British air forces to resume operations with full intensity. German columns attempting to move supplies forward were systematically destroyed from the air. Road junctions became killing grounds. Fuel trucks were favorite targets, their destruction crippling German mobility. The few supply convoys that reached frontline units carried far too little, far too late. Hartmann's men spent Christmas Day 1944 in frozen foxholes, conserving ammunition and wondering when American counterattacks would begin. They still had some of the captured American supplies, carefully rationed to extend them as long as possible. German resupply had essentially stopped. Everything they consumed now came from American stocks or local procurement. They were an army sustained entirely by enemy logistics. Dependent on capturing supplies, they lacked the fuel and vehicles to transport if captured. December 26th brought the American counterattack Hartmann had been anticipating. General George Patton's Third Army, having executed a remarkable 90-degree turn and driven north through appalling weather, struck the southern flank of the German salient. American armor and infantry attacked with the fury of forces certain of their superiority. German defenders, low on ammunition and fuel, exhausted from 2 weeks of combat and inadequate rations, could not hold. Hartmann's unit fought a series of delaying actions through late December, slowly giving ground while trying to avoid encirclement. American forces pursued relentlessly, their logistics allowing sustained operations that German forces could no longer match. American tanks advanced with adequate fuel. American artillery fired without ammunition constraints. American infantry received regular resupply of food, ammunition, and equipment. German forces scraped by on whatever they could find, gradually losing cohesion as units became separated and supply lines collapsed entirely. By early January 1945, German forces were in full retreat from the Bulge. The offensive had cost Germany over 100,000 casualties, including killed, wounded, and captured. Vehicle losses exceeded replaceable levels, with hundreds of tanks and trucks destroyed or abandoned. Fuel consumption had exhausted remaining reserves, crippling German mobility for subsequent operations. The strategic situation had worsened dramatically, with Germany's last offensive capacity spent achieving nothing. Hartmann survived the battle, though many in his unit did not. As they retreated through Belgium in early January, passing the same roads they had advanced along in December, he reflected on what the offensive had revealed. The captured American supplies that had sustained them told a story clearer than any intelligence report or strategic analysis. America possessed industrial capacity Germany could never match. This capacity translated directly into military effectiveness through logistics that kept soldiers supplied, vehicles operational, and units capable of sustained combat operations. The chocolate bar remained in Hartmann's pocket throughout the retreat. He had never eaten it, keeping it instead as a tangible reminder of the lesson learned in those frozen Belgian fields. Germany hadn't lost the Battle of the Bulge through tactical failures or strategic mistakes. Germany had lost because it challenged a nation whose factories could deliver chocolate bars from Pennsylvania to Belgian frontlines in 3 weeks while simultaneously producing unprecedented quantities of every other war material. No amount of soldier courage or officer competence could overcome such industrial disparity. Years later, Hartmann would write about his experiences during the Battle of the Bulge. His account focused less on the combat, which was savage and costly, and more on the captured supplies that revealed American industrial superiority. He described examining that first truck on December 17th, the abundance of chocolate and cigarettes and medical supplies that seemed impossible to German soldiers accustomed to scarcity. He described the gradual realization that these weren't isolated examples but systematic evidence of an industrial economy Germany couldn't comprehend, much less compete against. The Battle of the Bulge marked the last major German offensive in the West. After January 1945, German forces engaged only in desperate defensive operations as Allied armies advanced into German territory from west and east. The war would continue for 4 more months, with tremendous suffering and destruction, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany had exhausted its offensive capacity, consumed its reserves, and demonstrated that even tactical success couldn't overcome strategic material disadvantage. American logistics had proven decisive not just in the Battle of the Bulge but throughout the entire war. The ability to supply forces across oceans, maintain equipment in combat zones, deliver everything from food to fuel to ammunition reliably and in abundance. This capability determined modern war's outcome more certainly than battlefield tactics or strategic planning. Germany had entered the war with technological advantages in some areas and significant military expertise. But Germany had never possessed the industrial base or logistical sophistication to sustain total war against enemies with superior resources. The chocolate bar from Pennsylvania, manufactured 3 weeks before Hartmann discovered it in a captured American supply truck, embodied this reality more perfectly than any battle report or casualty statistic. It represented an economy that could treat luxuries as disposable items for frontline soldiers. It represented logistics that could deliver non-essential comfort goods across oceans and continents reliably. It represented industrial capacity that produced unprecedented quantities of military equipment while maintaining civilian standards of living that Germany couldn't approach even in peacetime. German soldiers who survived the Battle of the Bulge carried this knowledge forward. They had seen American abundance firsthand, had depended on captured American supplies for survival, had watched German logistics fail while American logistics operated with seeming effortlessly. Many would become prisoners in the coming months as Allied forces overran German positions. In American and British POW camps, they would experience further evidence of Allied material superiority through adequate food, medical care, and humane treatment made possible by resource abundance. German POWs in American captivity during late 1945 often received better rations than German troops had received during the war. The contrast was impossible to ignore or rationalize away. American prison camps, even operating under Geneva Convention minimums, provided more adequate nutrition and care than German military logistics had managed for its own soldiers. This wasn't kindness or generosity. This was simply the result of industrial capacity that could afford to feed and house prisoners adequately while simultaneously supplying armies fighting across two oceans. Hartmann became a prisoner in March 1945 when his unit surrendered to American forces in Western Germany. He spent 18 months in American captivity, working in agricultural labor details and experiencing American logistics from the prisoner perspective. The rations were adequate if monotonous. The medical care was professional and available when needed. The treatment, while firm, adhered to Geneva Convention standards. He watched young American soldiers, many barely out of their teens, manage prison camp operations with casual efficiency that would have been impossible in the Wehrmacht. After repatriation in late 1946, Hartmann returned to a Germany that had been devastated by war. Cities lay in ruins, their populations starving and desperate. Industrial capacity had been destroyed by Allied bombing and ground combat. Transportation infrastructure barely functioned. Millions were homeless, displaced, traumatized by years of total war and total defeat. The contrast with America, which had fought the war across two oceans while maintaining the highest standard of living among all combatants, was impossible to ignore. In the decades after the war, Hartmann became a teacher, educating young Germans about the realities of the conflict their nation had unleashed and lost. He emphasized material factors over military narratives, teaching his students that wars in the modern age were won in factories and supply depots as much as on battlefields. He used the chocolate bar, still preserved though the chocolate itself had long since degraded, as a teaching tool. This came from Pennsylvania to Belgium in 3 weeks, he would tell his students. Think about what that means. Think about the industrial capacity and logistical efficiency required to achieve such delivery. His students often struggled to understand the lesson. It was just chocolate after all, a trivial item hardly worth historical attention. But Hartmann patiently explained that it was never about the chocolate itself. It was about what the chocolate represented. System-level thinking, industrial sophistication, logistical excellence, resource abundance. These factors determined modern war's outcome more reliably than tactical prowess or strategic brilliance. Germany had possessed excellent soldiers, capable officers, sophisticated military doctrine. But Germany had lacked the industrial base to sustain total war against enemies with superior resources and better logistics. The Battle of the Bulge had demonstrated this truth with brutal clarity. German forces had achieved tactical surprise, had broken through Allied lines, had created a substantial salient into enemy-held territory. But they had failed to capture critical objectives, had failed to seize necessary supplies, had failed to sustain operations beyond initial momentum. American logistics had proven resilient enough to survive the shock, flexible enough to respond rapidly, and robust enough to sustain counterattacks that eliminated German gains within weeks. By late January 1945, the Battle of the Bulge had ended with complete German defeat. The territory gained had been lost. The casualties suffered had been irreplaceable. The equipment destroyed had consumed Germany's last reserves. The operation had achieved nothing except demonstrating that Germany could no longer mount effective offensive operations regardless of how desperate the strategic situation became. The lesson Hartmann had learned examining captured American supplies on December 17 had been validated through subsequent events. Industrial capacity determined modern war's outcome. Germany had lacked that capacity. America had possessed it in overwhelming abundance. The final irony was that German soldiers had understood this truth before German leadership accepted it. Frontline troops who captured American equipment, who depended on American supplies for survival, who witnessed American abundance even during retreat. These soldiers recognized that Germany had already lost long before the war officially ended. But military discipline and political control prevented this knowledge from affecting German policy. The war continued for 4 more months after the Battle of the Bulge, consuming hundreds of thousands of additional lives, destroying what remained of German infrastructure, inflicting suffering that served no strategic purpose. Hartmann survived to see Germany's surrender, its occupation, its division, and eventually its reconstruction. He lived long enough to witness the economic miracle that transformed West Germany into a prosperous industrial democracy by the 1960s. He watched as German manufacturers adopted American mass production techniques, as German logistics learned from Allied models, as German industry rebuilt using principles that emphasized efficiency and scale over theoretical perfection. The lessons learned through defeat had been absorbed and applied. But he never forgot that frozen December morning in Belgium when he opened a captured American supply truck and discovered chocolate bars manufactured in Pennsylvania 3 weeks earlier. That moment had revealed truth that no amount of propaganda could obscure and no amount of tactical success could overcome. Modern war was industrial war, determined by productive capacity and logistical excellence more than battlefield prowess. Germany had challenged nations possessing superior industrial capability. The outcome had been inevitable from that fundamental asymmetry. The chocolate bar, preserved in a display case in Hartmann's study, remained a memorial to that realization. Not a memorial to defeat or suffering, though both were real and profound, but a memorial to understanding, to the moment when truth became undeniable despite years of propaganda and indoctrination. Germany had lost not because its soldiers lacked courage or its officers lacked skill. Germany had lost because it had challenged powers whose factories could deliver chocolate from Pennsylvania to Belgian frontlines in 3 weeks while simultaneously producing everything else needed to sustain armies fighting across continents and oceans. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.